Who let him in? This isn't a charity meeting. The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp and deliberate, slicing through the polished silence of the boardroom like a blade that had been waiting for a target. Every head turned, not toward the speaker, but toward the man standing just inside the glass doors, as if the accusation itself had given them permission to see him the same way. Darius King didn't flinch. He didn't rush to defend himself, didn't glance around for approval, didn't even adjust the simple black blazer draped over his shoulders. He just stood there, calm, measured, like someone who had already calculated every outcome in the room and decided none of them required urgency. The boardroom was everything you'd expect: floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown, a 40-foot walnut table polished to a mirror shine, leather chairs that cost more than most people's monthly rent, but the atmosphere had shifted in an instant. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was charged. "I think you're lost," another voice added, smoother this time, almost polite, but with an edge that made it worse. "Executive meetings are closed sessions." A few chuckles followed, low and controlled, the kind people use when they want to signal agreement without committing too loudly. Darius stepped forward anyway. One step, then another. His shoes barely made a sound against the marble floor, but each movement seemed to tighten the air, like the room itself was bracing for something it didn't yet understand. He reached the table and, without asking, without hesitation, pulled out a chair. Not at the edge, not tucked away near the corner, but near the center. And then he sat down. That's when the discomfort became visible. Eyes shifted, shoulders stiffened. One board member leaned toward another, whispering something that ended with a smirk. "Excuse me," the first man said again, louder now, irritation creeping into his tone. "You can't just sit there. That seat is reserved." Darius rested his hands lightly on the table, fingers relaxed, gaze steady. "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said. His voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It landed anyway, firm and controlled, like a statement that didn't require validation. For a moment, no one responded. Not because they accepted it, but because they didn't know how to process it. Then came the shift. "Security should have stopped this at the door," a woman muttered, flipping through a folder, as if the papers in front of her suddenly mattered more than the man across the table. "We're already behind schedule." Another man leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying Darius with open skepticism. "Let's not waste time," he said. "Whoever you are, you're in the wrong room." But the meeting didn't stop. That was the strange part. Instead of removing him immediately, instead of escalating, they chose something quieter, something more deliberate. They continued, as if he weren't there. Slides appeared on the screen. Financial projections, acquisition strategies. Voices filled the space again, confident, rehearsed, practiced, and Darius listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't challenge. He just watched, eyes moving from one speaker to the next, absorbing every detail like someone reading between lines no one else realized existed. Minutes passed. 10, maybe 12. Long enough for the room to forget the disruption, long enough for their comfort to return. That's when Darius leaned forward slightly. Not enough to demand attention, just enough to shift it. "Can you clarify that projection?" he asked, nodding toward the screen. The room paused again. This time, it wasn't confusion. It was annoyance. "We're not taking questions," the same man snapped. "Especially not from," he stopped himself. Not because he couldn't finish the sentence, but because finishing it would make it real. Darius tilted his head slightly, almost curious. "From what?" he asked. Silence. Not empty this time, but heavy, because now the question wasn't just about him. It was about them. And for the first time since he walked in, something deeper than irritation flickered across a few faces. Doubt. Just a trace. Just enough to matter. But not enough to stop what was coming next. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like a slow crack forming beneath polished glass, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once it started spreading. And Darius King felt it before anyone else acknowledged it. That thin line between control and collapse beginning to tremble under the weight of a single unanswered question. The man who had challenged him cleared his throat, forcing a chuckle that did not quite land, then leaned back in his chair as if distance alone could re-establish authority. "We are not here to entertain interruptions," he said, choosing his words carefully now, each one measured but edged with irritation. "This is a closed executive session." Darius nodded slightly, as if he agreed with the principal, then glanced toward the screen again where a series of quarterly projections glowed in clean, confident numbers. "Then you should want them to be accurate," he replied. No one laughed this time. The woman at the far end of the table, the chief financial officer Laura Bennett, shifted in her seat and tapped her pen against her notebook, her eyes narrowing not in anger, but in calculation, because unlike the others, she was not focused on his presence alone. She was listening to what he said and, more importantly, how he said it, like someone who understood the difference between noise and signal. "Those projections have already been reviewed," another board member added quickly, eager to regain control of the rhythm. "Extensively." Darius tilted his head just slightly, the movement small but deliberate. "By whom?" he asked. That was when the first real pause hit. Not the polite kind, not the dismissive kind, but the kind that lingers just long enough to expose something underneath. Papers shuffled. Someone adjusted their glasses. The answer should have been immediate. It was not. "By this board," the man finally said, his tone firmer now, as if repetition alone could reinforce truth. Darius nodded again, slower this time, then leaned back into his chair, fingers interlacing as he absorbed the response without comment. But the damage had already begun. Laura Bennett's pen stopped tapping. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the system monitor embedded into the table, then back to Darius, then to the others, as if she was cross-checking something invisible to everyone else. "Let us move forward," she said, her voice steady but lower now, more controlled. "We are losing time." The presentation resumed, but it did not feel the same. The confidence had shifted, slides advanced, but the energy behind them had thinned, like a performance that suddenly realized it was being watched more closely than expected. Darius did not interrupt again right away. He let them speak. He let them build. He let them settle back into the illusion of control they were so eager to reclaim. And then, just as the room began to stabilize, he spoke again. "You are projecting a 12% increase in operating margin based on a cost reduction model that has not been approved," he said, his voice even, almost conversational. The sentence landed heavier than anything before it, not because it was loud, but because it was precise. Laura's head turned sharply toward the screen. One of the men blinked twice, then leaned forward as if proximity would help him understand what he had just heard. "That model is under review," he said quickly. "It is not finalized." Darius's gaze did not move. "It was rejected," he corrected. And just like that, the room shifted again, this time faster, sharper, the kind of shift that does not ask permission. Laura Bennett reached for her tablet, fingers moving across the screen with practiced speed, pulling up internal documents, timestamps, approvals, denials. Her expression changed in real time, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to be seen. Enough to matter. "Where did you get that information?" the first man demanded, his voice no longer smooth, no longer controlled. There it was. Not curiosity, not concern. Fear, dressed up as authority. Darius met his eyes calmly. "From the same place you should have," he said. The words did not echo, but they did not need to, because now it was no longer about whether he belonged in the room. It was about why he knew more than the people who claimed to own it. And that question, the one no one had asked out loud yet, was already beginning to take shape in every mind at that table, growing louder with every second they failed to answer it. The air did not recover this time. It tightened, compressing around the table like something unseen had just entered the room and claimed space without asking. And Darius King remained exactly where he was, still, composed, as if the tension belonged to everyone else and not to him. While across from him the man who had been leading the meeting shifted in his chair again, this time not out of annoyance, but out of something less controlled, something closer to uncertainty that he could not quite hide anymore. "That information is confidential," he said, his voice sharper now, less polished, like it had lost its edge of performance and slipped into something more defensive. "Access to that level of data is restricted." Darius did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to make the statement feel weaker than it sounded. Because in a room like this, certainty was everything, and hesitation was the first crack. Laura Bennett's tablet lit up with additional files, her fingers moving faster now, pulling deeper layers, her eyes scanning lines that confirmed what Darius had already said. And when she finally looked up again, the difference in her expression was undeniable. It was no longer curiosity, it was recognition, not of who he was yet, but of what he represented, and more importantly, what he had access to. "He is right," she said quietly. The words were not loud, but they landed heavier than anything that had been said so far. Heads turned toward her instantly, the room recalibrating around the new center of gravity. "The model was rejected 2 weeks ago," she continued, her voice steady but now carrying a weight that demanded attention. "It did not meet compliance thresholds." The man across the table blinked, then shook his head slightly, as if denying it could somehow undo the shift that had already happened. "That is not finalized," he insisted, but the conviction was gone, replaced by something thinner, something that did not hold. Darius leaned forward just slightly, not aggressively, not confrontationally, just enough to re-enter the center of the room without raising his voice. "You are presenting projections based on a strategy that has already been denied," he said. "That is not oversight. That is exposure." The word hung there. Exposure. It did not accuse. It revealed. And that was more dangerous. One of the board members near the end of the table exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping once against the polished surface before stopping completely, like even small movements felt too loud now. "Who are you?" he asked. Not as a challenge, not as an insult, but as a necessity, because the question was no longer optional. Darius looked at him, his expression unchanged, calm, measured, like the answer existed but was not yet required. "Someone who pays attention," he said. The response was simple, almost understated, but it shifted something again because it was not a denial, it was not an explanation, it was a positioning, and in that moment it forced everyone else to reconsider theirs. Laura's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in alignment, as if pieces were beginning to connect in ways she had not expected when the meeting started. She glanced toward the system panel again, then back to Darius, then to the others, her posture adjusting almost imperceptibly, like someone preparing for a change before. It was officially announced. "We should verify access logs," she said, her voice controlled but firm now. "If he has visibility into restricted decisions, then he is either cleared for it or there's a serious breach." The suggestion landed like a fork in the road. Either option led somewhere uncomfortable. The man who had been speaking earlier hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the others, searching for support that did not come quickly enough. "There is no breach," he said finally, but the words felt like they were being said to convince himself as much as anyone else. Darius watched the exchange without interruption, his stillness now carrying more weight than before, because it was no longer being mistaken for uncertainty, it was being recognized as control. And control, in a room like this, was everything. A faint memory moved through his mind, not as a distraction, but as a quiet reminder. A conference room years ago, smaller, less polished, where he had been asked to wait outside while decisions about his own project were made without him, where his presence had been tolerated but not respected, where his voice had been considered optional until the results proved otherwise, and he had learned something then that never left him. That silence, when used correctly, was not absence, it was leverage. Back in the present, the room felt different now, not just tense, but aware, like something important was unfolding just beneath the surface, and no one wanted to be the one caught on the wrong side of it. "Check the logs," Laura said again, this time not as a suggestion, but as a directive. And for the first time since Darius walked into the room, no one dismissed the idea. No one moved immediately. And that hesitation spoke louder than any objection could have, because in a room built on certainty, even a second of delay meant something had already shifted beyond control, and Darius King watched it happen in real time, without changing his posture, without adjusting his tone, as if he had seen this exact moment unfold long before he ever walked through the door. Laura Bennett turned her tablet slightly, angling it so the data was no longer private, her fingers tapping once, then twice, pulling up the access logs that most people in the room had never needed to question before because systems like this were not designed to be challenged, they were designed to be trusted. "Pull the executive clearance records," she said, her voice steady, no longer tentative, but not yet confrontational either, just precise, like someone stepping carefully on a ground that might shift beneath her. The man who had been leading the meeting let out a quiet breath, the kind people use when they are trying to buy time without admitting it. "That is unnecessary," he replied quickly, too quickly, and the speed alone gave away more than the words. "We are getting distracted." But no one echoed him this time. Not a single nod, not a single agreement, because distraction was no longer the problem. Verification was. Laura did not look up. "If there is nothing to hide, then it will take less than 30 seconds, she said. The room absorbed that. 30 seconds. A measurable amount of time. Short enough to seem harmless. Long enough to reveal everything. Across the table, one of the older board members shifted forward, his expression tightening as he adjusted his glasses. "Run it," he said quietly, and that was all it took. Authority did not disappear. It redistributed. The system panel at the center of the table flickered as Laura synced her tablet, the interface lighting up with clean, organized rows of data, timestamps, clearance levels, access histories, all presented with the same confidence the earlier projections had carried. But this time the numbers did not reassure anyone. They challenged them. Darius remained still, his gaze steady, not on the screen, but on the people watching it, because the data was not the real story, their reaction to it was. The first line appeared, then another, then a third. Names scrolled, access levels displayed, standard permissions, limited permissions, executive approvals. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. The tension did not disappear, but it paused, like a breath being held just before release. Then Laura's fingers stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough. Enough for someone paying attention to notice. "Wait," she said, almost to herself, but the room heard it anyway. Her eyes moved across the screen again, slower now, more deliberate, like she was reading something that did not match what she expected to find. "There is another tier," she added, her voice quieter but sharper. The man across from her frowned. "There is no other tier," he said, but his certainty had thinned again, reduced to habit instead of fact. Laura did not respond to him. She tapped once more, expanding the field, pulling a layer that had not been visible before, a layer that required a level of access most people in the room did not possess. And when it appeared, it did not flash, it did not announce itself. It simply existed, calm, undeniable. A new column, a new classification, override authority. The words sat there, plain and unembellished, but they carried more weight than anything that had been presented all morning. "That is not standard," someone whispered, not intending to be heard, but in the silence it carried. Laura's eyes moved down the column, scanning, verifying, cross-referencing, and then she stopped again, this time longer, her posture shifting almost imperceptibly as the realization settled in. She did not look surprised. She looked certain. "There is only one active profile with this level of access," she said. No one spoke. No one interrupted, because now they all understood what that meant. The man who had challenged Darius earlier leaned forward, his hands pressing lightly against the table, as if grounding himself in something solid. "Display it," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier confidence. Laura hesitated for half a second, not out of doubt, but out of awareness, because she understood that once this was visible, there would be no returning to what the room had been before. Then she tapped the screen. The profile expanded. Name, clearance, authority level, voting weight, all of it aligned in a clean, structured format that left no room for interpretation. And for a brief moment, no one looked at Darius. They looked at the screen, because it was easier than reconciling what they were about to realize. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, their attention shifted back to him, and for the first time since he had entered the room, The question was no longer whether he belonged there. It was how they had failed to recognize that he did all along. No one spoke when the names settled on the screen, and the silence that followed was not confusion anymore. It was recognition fighting its way through disbelief, slow and heavy, like a truth the room had not prepared itself to accept, and Darius King did not rush to fill that silence. He let it expand, let it press against every polished surface, every carefully constructed assumption that had been made the moment he walked through the door. Laura Bennett was the first to move, not dramatically, not with shock, but with a quiet shift in posture that said everything her words had not yet caught up to, her shoulders straightening slightly, her gaze no longer scanning for answers but settling into understanding. And when she finally looked at him again, it was different, not cautious, not skeptical, but aligned. "Override authority," she said softly, almost as if she needed to hear out loud to confirm what the screen had already made undeniable. One of the men at the far end let out a slow breath, his hand sliding away from the documents in front of him as if they had suddenly become irrelevant, because they had every number, every projection, every carefully prepared argument, now sitting beneath a layer of authority they had not accounted for. "That profile does not make sense," the man who had challenged Darius earlier said, his voice thinner now, less certain, clinging to the last pieces of control he thought he still had. "That level of clearance requires board approval." Darius finally shifted. Not much, just enough to lean forward slightly, his hand still resting calmly on the table, his expression unchanged. "It already has it," he said. The words were simple, direct, and they did not rise in volume, but they landed with precision, cutting through the last layer of resistance in the room. Laura's fingers moved again, pulling up the approval logs, the voting records, the signatures that validated what the system was showing. And, as the documentation aligned with the profile, the room did not react all at once. It unraveled, piece by piece, each person processing at their own pace, each realization arriving like a delayed echo. One member leaned back, eyes fixed on the screen. Another lowered his gaze to the table, avoiding the inevitable connection forming in his mind, and the man who had spoken the loudest earlier now sat still, his silence louder than any accusation could have been. A memory surfaced in Darius's mind again, not as a distraction, but as a thread connecting past to present. A smaller room years ago, fluorescent lights instead of skyline views, a moment where he had been asked to wait outside while decisions about his own future were made behind closed doors, told politely that his presence was not necessary, that his input would be considered later, and he had stood there, listening through the door, understanding something in that moment that would shape everything that came after. That power did not announce itself. It revealed itself, and only when it mattered. Back in the present, the boardroom no longer felt like a place of authority. It felt like a place of exposure. Every assumption laid bare, every miscalculation visible in the quiet between breaths. "This is not possible," one voice said. But it was softer now, almost resigned, like the speaker already knew the answer before finishing the sentence. Darius looked around the table, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity, his gaze moving from one face to the next, taking in the shift, the recognition, the weight of what they had all just realized. "You asked who I was," he said, his voice steady, measured, controlled. He let the words sit for a moment, not as a pause, but as a deliberate space, a moment for the room to lean into what was coming next. "You had access to the answer the entire time." No one interrupted him. No one tried to reclaim the floor, because the floor had already moved. Laura's voice came again, quieter but certain now, no hesitation left. "Darius King," she said, reading directly from the screen, but the way she said it was not like reading a name. It was like acknowledging a position, a weight, a reality that had been present long before they noticed it. The man who had spoken first closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, as if trying to reset something that could not be reset. "You should have identified yourself," he said. But even as he spoke, the argument sounded weaker than before, like a defense that had arrived too late. Darius did not react to the accusation, did not raise his voice, did not lean into confrontation. "You should have verified," he replied. And that was the moment it broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because the responsibility shifted not onto him, but back onto them, where it had been all along. And in that shift, the power in the room did not just change, it clarified, settling into its true position with a finality that no one could ignore. The room did not recover after that. It reorganized itself, quietly and completely, like a structure realizing its foundation had shifted, and there was no returning to the version of reality it had been operating under just minutes before. And Darius King sat at the center of it all, not elevated, not imposing, just present in a way that made everything else adjust around him without force. No one questioned his seat anymore. No one suggested security. Those options had dissolved the moment the system confirmed what their assumptions had denied. Laura Bennett slowly set her tablet down, her movements deliberate now, controlled in a different way, not cautious but aligned, like someone who had recalibrated her position based on truth instead of hierarchy. "We need to pause this meeting," she said, her voice firm but not loud. And this time no one challenged her. The man who had been leading earlier leaned back, his fingers pressing together as if trying to reassemble a sense of control that no longer fit the room. "On what grounds?" he asked, but the question lacked weight, because he already knew the answer. Darius did not rush to respond. He let the question sit, let it echo just long enough for everyone to feel how unnecessary it had become. Then he spoke. "On the grounds that the information being presented is inaccurate, the process behind it is compromised, and the oversight expected from this board has failed to meet its own standards," he said, his tone even, measured, not accusatory, but absolute. The words did not attack. They defined, and definition, in a room like this, carried more power than confrontation. A few heads lowered slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, because the statement was not exaggerated, it was precise, and that precision made it undeniable. One of the members cleared his throat, shifting in his chair as he looked toward Laura, then back to Darius. "What exactly are you suggesting?" he asked. Darius met his gaze without hesitation. "I am not suggesting anything," he replied. "I am initiating a review." The distinction landed immediately. Suggestion implied discussion. Initiation implied authority. Laura nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes moving to the system panel again, as if confirming what she already knew. "An executive review requires authorization," someone added. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction, because the screen in front of them had already answered that question. Darius leaned back slightly, his posture unchanged in its calm, his presence steady in a way that made the room feel smaller without him needing to raise his voice. "Authorization has already been granted," he said. There was no pause after that. No hesitation, because now the sequence was clear. This was not a reaction. It was a process already in motion. Laura reached for her tablet again, her fingers moving with a new kind of certainty, pulling up the internal protocols, the escalation pathways that most of the board had never seen activated in real time. And as the documentation appeared, structured and precise, it became clear that what was happening was not spontaneous, it was procedural. "This triggers a compliance audit," she said, her voice steady, her eyes scanning the details. "Full scope." One of the men exhaled sharply, leaning forward now, his earlier confidence replaced by urgency. "That is excessive," he said. "We can resolve this internally." Darius looked at him, not dismissing the concern, but not accepting it either. "You already tried to resolve it internally," he said. "That is why we are here." The sentence did not raise in volume, but it carried a weight that settled across the table, because it pointed not just to the current moment, but to a pattern, a series of decisions that had led them here. And for the first time, the board was not just being questioned, it was being evaluated. A quiet memory moved through Darius again, a boardroom years ago where he had presented a proposal that had been dismissed without review, not because it lacked merit, but because it came from someone they did not expect to hold authority, and he had walked out of that room understanding something that would guide him from that point forward, that systems do not fail loudly. They fail quietly, through assumptions, through unchecked patterns, through the belief that position alone guarantees correctness. Back in the present, the system panel updated again, flags appearing next to specific entries. Not dramatic, not alarming in appearance, but significant in implication, each one marking a point of review, a decision to be re-examined, a process to be verified. Laura's voice came again, lower now, more focused. "This will extend beyond this meeting," she said. "Legal, compliance, and executive oversight will all be involved." No one interrupted her, because now the scale of what was happening had expanded beyond the room itself. The man who had spoken first earlier looked at Darius again, but this time there was no challenge in his expression, only the realization of what had been set in motion. "You planned this," he said quietly. Darius held his gaze calm, steady. "I prepared for this," he replied. And that difference, small as it sounded, changed everything, because planning implied manipulation, but preparation implied awareness. And in that moment, the board understood that what they were facing was not a reaction to them. It was the consequence of everything they had chosen not to see. The room did not feel like a boardroom anymore. It felt like a threshold, a precise moment where everything that had been assumed was now being rewritten in real time. And Darius King did not move to dominate that moment. He allowed it to unfold, because true authority did not rush to be recognized. It waited until recognition became unavoidable. The system panel continued to glow at the center of the table. Lines of data still visible, still undeniable, and yet no one was looking at it anymore, because the truth had already shifted from the screen to the man sitting among them. Laura Bennett remained composed, her posture steady, but there was no question left in her expression now, only clarity, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the kind of certainty that only comes after doubt has been fully resolved. "Executive review protocol has been activated," she said, her tone even, professional, but now aligned with the authority that had quietly taken control of the room. "All board decisions within the last 2 quarters are subject to audit." The words landed like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that could not be undone. One of the board members shifted sharply in his chair, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the pressure beneath it. "This is an overreach," he said, but the objection lacked structure, lacked grounding, because it was not based on process anymore, it was based on discomfort. Darius turned his gaze toward him, calm, measured, the same way he had looked at every challenge so far, without urgency, without emotion, but with a clarity that made resistance feel misplaced. "It is a correction," he said, and that was the moment everything aligned, not because the words were louder, but because they were exact. Correction, not punishment, not retaliation, just alignment with what should have already been in place. Laura's tablet updated again, the system syncing in real time, and as new markers appeared beside specific decisions, the pattern became impossible to ignore. It was not one mistake. It was not one oversight. It was a sequence, a chain, a structure that had drifted from accountability and continued unchecked because no one had forced it to stop. Until now, the man who had led the meeting earlier leaned forward again, but this time there was no attempt to control the room, only a need to understand what was happening to it. "What happens next?" he asked. The question was different now. It was no longer a challenge. It was a request. Darius did not answer immediately. He let the question settle, let the weight of it be felt, because the answer was not just about process, it was about consequence. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, precise, unchanged. "Now we separate responsibility from assumption," he said, "and we correct both." The room absorbed that slowly, each person processing it through their own position, their own decisions, their own exposure within the system that was now being examined. Laura glanced down at the screen once more, then back up, her expression firm. "The audit is already identifying irregularities," she said. "Voting discrepancies, approval gaps, unauthorized projections." Each phrase added another layer, another piece of clarity to what had been hidden behind confidence just minutes before. A quiet realization moved through the room, not all at once, but steadily, that this was not just about one meeting, one mistake, one misjudgment. It was about an entire structure that had been operating without being challenged, and now was being seen clearly for the first time. Darius leaned back slightly, his presence unchanged, his control never needing to assert itself because it had already been established. "You built your decisions on perception," he said, his gaze moving across the table, meeting each set of eyes without hesitation. "Not verification." No one responded, because there was nothing left to defend. The truth had already settled into place. A memory passed through his mind again, not as a distraction, but as a quiet anchor, a moment years ago when he had been told that leadership was not about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the one who saw what others overlooked, who corrected what others ignored, and who held the line when systems drifted away from their purpose. Back in the present, the boardroom felt different, not tense anymore, but defined, every role clearer, every assumption stripped away, every decision now subject to a level of scrutiny that had not existed before he walked in. The man who had spoken first earlier finally exhaled, his posture settling into something more honest, less performative. "So this is it," he said quietly. Darius met his gaze one last time, calm, unwavering. "No," he said, "this is where it starts." And in that moment, the shift was complete, not because of what had been said, but because of what could no longer be undone. No one realized how quickly everything was about to change until the system moved first, not with noise, not with alarms, but with precision, quiet, and absolute. And Darius King did not even look at the screen when it happened because he already knew it would. The sequence had been set long before anyone in that room thought to question him. Laura Bennett's tablet vibrated lightly against the table, a subtle signal that something had updated beyond manual input. And when her eyes dropped to the screen, the shift in her expression was immediate, not shock, not confusion, but confirmation, like watching a final piece fall exactly where it was designed to land. "The audit is escalating," she said, her voice steady but carrying a new weight now, something deeper than observation, something closer to consequence. The central display updated in real time, entries reorganizing, markers shifting from passive review to active action. And then the first flag changed color. Not dramatic, not loud, just final. "What does that mean?" one of the board members asked, his voice tighter now, stripped of the confidence that had defined him earlier. Laura did not hesitate this time. "It means the system is no longer reviewing," she said. "It is executing." The word settled over the table like a verdict already signed. A notification appeared beside the first name, then another, then a third, each one clean, structured, impossible to misinterpret. "Access suspended. Voting privileges revoked. Interim removal pending review." The room did not react all at once. It fractured, each person processing their own exposure, their own position within the system that was now moving without waiting for permission. The man who had spoken the loudest earlier leaned forward sharply, his hand pressing against the table as if he could physically stop what was happening through proximity alone. "You cannot do this without a full board vote," he said, his voice rising for the first time, not in authority, but in resistance. Darius finally turned his gaze toward him fully, calm, unmoved, his expression unchanged despite the escalation around him. "This is the vote," he said. The words were quiet, controlled, but they carried a finality that did not invite argument, because the system itself had already spoken. Laura's fingers moved again, pulling up the clause, the protocol that most in the room had never expected to see activated, the emergency governance structure designed for moments when oversight failed at the highest level. And as the documentation appeared, it aligned perfectly with the actions unfolding in real time. "Majority override authority," she said, reading directly from the system. "Activated by controlling shareholder." The phrase landed heavier than anything before it, because now it was not just about access, it was about ownership, control, and the legal framework that backed every action being taken. One of the members near the end of the table exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping as the realization settled in fully. "How much?" he asked quietly, not looking at the screen anymore, but at Darius. Darius met his gaze without hesitation. "Enough," he said. And that was all it took, because the number did not matter anymore. The effect did. Another notification appeared, then another. Half the names on the board now marked with the same status. Their authority reduced to a line of text, their influence paused, their decisions under review. No shouting, no chows, just quiet, irreversible change happening in real time. Laura looked up again, her voice steady, aligned completely now with the structure that had taken over the room. Effective immediately, 5 board members are suspended pending audit outcome, she said. All associated decisions are frozen. The man who had tried to lead earlier sat back slowly, his expression no longer defensive, no longer resistant, but reflective, as if replaying every moment from the start of the meeting and realizing exactly where everything had shifted beyond recovery. You walked in here knowing this would happen, he said quietly. Darius did not deny it. He did not confirm it either. He simply held his gaze, calm, composed, as if the answer was already understood. I walked in here knowing what needed to be corrected, he replied. The difference settled into the room with weight. Because correction did not require emotion. It required clarity. And clarity was exactly what had just dismantled everything they thought was stable. The system panel dimmed slightly as the updates completed, the new structure settling into place, not as chaos, but as order, precise and controlled. And for the first time since the meeting began, there was no tension left, only the quiet understanding that nothing in that room would return to what it had been before he walked in. The room did not erupt after the final update. It settled, and that stillness carried more weight than any reaction ever could, because what had just happened was not chaos. It was order asserting itself with precision, and Darius King remained seated at the center of it all, not elevated by the moment, not changed by it, just exactly who he had been when he first walked in. The difference now was not him. It was everyone else. No one questioned his presence anymore. No one looked past him. Every gaze in the room had shifted, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, the kind that arrives too late to prevent the outcome, but just in time to understand it. Laura Bennett closed her tablet slowly, the soft sound marking the end of the system's movement, her posture composed, aligned, no longer navigating uncertainty, but standing firmly within clarity. The board structure has been adjusted, she said, her voice calm, professional, but now carrying the authority that had been missing before. Interim governance will proceed under revised oversight until the audit is complete. No one interrupted her, because there was nothing left to interrupt. The man who had spoken first at the beginning of the meeting sat quietly now, his earlier confidence replaced by something more honest, not defeat, but awareness, the kind that comes when assumptions are stripped away and replaced with truth. He looked at Darius, not with resistance, not with challenge, but with a question he did not need to ask out loud anymore. Darius met his gaze, steady, composed, his presence unchanged from the moment he entered, because this had never been about proving something, it had been about correcting something. He rose from his seat slowly, not to dominate the room, not to close the moment with force, but simply because it was time, and as he stood, the shift completed itself, not in the system, but in the people around him. You built a process that trusted position more than verification, he said, his voice even, controlled, carrying through the room without effort. And when that happens, accountability becomes optional. No one moved. No one spoke, because every word landed exactly where it needed to. He let the silence follow, not as a pause, but as space for the truth to settle fully, then continued, his tone unchanged, precise, deliberate. I did not come here to disrupt this board, he said. I came here to align it. The difference mattered. Disruption implied chaos. Alignment implied correction. And correction was exactly what they had just witnessed. Laura's eyes followed him as he stepped away from the table, her expression steady, understanding now fully anchored, not just in what had happened, but in why it had needed to happen. The system panel dimmed further, its role complete, the structure it supported now reset into something more stable, more accountable, more real. One of the remaining board members leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. And if we had handled this differently? He asked. It was not a challenge. It was reflection. Darius paused for a moment, not turning back immediately, but considering the question with the same calm precision he had carried from the beginning. Then he looked over his shoulder, meeting the man's gaze one last time. Then this meeting would have looked exactly the same, he said, just without the correction. The words did not carry judgment. They carried truth, because the outcome had never been about how they reacted in the moment. It had been about what they had allowed to exist before it. He turned back toward the glass doors, the city skyline stretching out beyond them, unchanged, indifferent to what had just unfolded inside. And for a brief second, the contrast was clear, the world outside moving forward as it always had, while inside, something fundamental had just been reset. As he reached the door, he stopped, not to linger, not to reclaim attention, but to leave them with something that would remain long after he was gone. "You did not fail because you lacked information," he said, without turning around. "You failed because you chose not to verify it." Then he stepped out, the door closing softly behind him, and the sound was quiet, almost insignificant, but it marked the end of something larger than the meeting itself. Inside the room, no one spoke immediately. They did not need to, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through volume, not through force, but through clarity, and clarity, once seen, does not disappear. It stays. It reshapes. And in that room, in that moment, it had done exactly that.